We will be in 1 Timothy chapter 5 today. And when I was in school in Memphis, W.B. West had him for a couple of classes, and excuse me, especially in the afternoon, he would look around and he would say, "Good afternoon, scholars." And we'd all look at each other and say, "Who's he talking to?" Because it didn't feel like that was any of us. And I always feel like when we gather for Bible study, you remember the Bereans were more excellent because they studied the scriptures daily to see if these things were true. And so, good morning to Bereans, whether you're here or online, and it's a blessing to have you with us. With the challenge of the false teachers, we've noticed the expression again. I just shiver nearly every time I think about it. From Acts 20, among the eldership, fierce wolves would arise, not sparing the flock. Then Paul sends Timothy to work with the church in Ephesus after, and it's kind of like an invasion has taken place. And because of that, then his example, the way that he conducts himself, will be under scrutiny all the time because especially if you can't find fault with the message, then you try to find fault with the messenger. And so Paul in chapter 5 is going to give some very specific instructions. And as a young man, I just like the expression from chapter 3, here's how we conduct ourselves in the household of faith. And that's such an important term because Paul is going to use a number of different images for the church. Sometimes he'll talk about the church as a body. Sometimes he'll talk about it as a building, the bride. But he also loves the family terminology. And he's going to introduce specifically the different groups in the church. Timothy, here's how I want you to treat these people. And the longest discussion in chapter 5 is going to be about widows and then also about the church's responsibility to elders. In thinking about especially the section on the widows, just several things came to mind. One of the first was Jesus stands up in his home synagogue in Luke chapter 4, reads from Isaiah, and then says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And then as he starts talking about the fulfillment of scriptures, he just mentions there were many lepers in Israel, but Elisha was sent to Naaman, maybe Elijah rather, and then he also says there were many widows in Israel, but he was sent to a woman from Sidon who is a Gentile. And because Jesus included God's work and God's will with Gentiles, then they sought to take him to a cliff and throw him off of the cliff. They just were really, really upset at the thought that God's will was being directed toward a widow, specifically who was a Gentile. When we come to the book of Acts, the first problem that is mentioned in the early church was the neglect of the Greek Hellenistic widows. And it really doesn't matter whether it was intentional or accidental. The 7 men who are Greek speakers are appointed, and one of the first issues that comes up in the church is the care for widows. What is significant is that with a few exceptions, it would be really difficult for most women to have some type of a job, some type of a trade that would earn really an adequate income. And even when Jesus raises the widow's son, a part of the blessing for her was that obviously not having a husband, then her son would be a huge part of her financial future, her ability to live and to eat and to do things. And so I use the expression, the widows were the most vulnerable part of society. And it's very interesting both in the teaching of Jesus. There were some very specific things directed toward that. And you just kind of start going down the list. There was nothing like Social Security. Typically, there weren't pension plans. There wasn't anything set up officially from the government to help support widows. And this became a part of the reason why so much instruction is given in the New Testament, and we'll see some about how the early church worked and dealt with those. When you look at number 3, just going down the front of the outline, the book of James has this wonderful expression at the end of chapter 1, pure religion. And that's such an interesting term, that which is kind of focused, that which is godly. Pure religion is this, and most of our translations have the word to visit. And that's not bad, but we'll see a definition here for a second. Visit the widows and the orphans, and to help them in their affliction. And when you look at this word visit, several things come up in terms of a translation of the word. I examine, I look for, I visit, I care for, I am concerned about. And I like this one most of all, to go see a person with a helpful intent. So it wasn't just the fact that you would kind of go visit them in terms of to see them. It was to go see them with the intent of looking after and caring and helping them. Remember when Jesus is in Matthew 25 and he's going through this list of things and starts talking about, I was naked and you didn't clothe me, and I was in prison and you didn't visit me? And see, there's the term. And they ask, Lord, when did we see you? And they list all of these things. And he says, insomuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Well, what is the term? To visit someone in prison is to go, not just to say, well, hello, how are you doing? But it's to go to check on them, to see how they're doing, and to see what needs they might have, if there's anything they could do to help them. This is just kind of shuddering. Some of our dear friends, Norm and Denise Easter at Memorial Road, are deeply involved with 3 mission teams in Cuba. And the Cubans will allow students to go to the Baxter Institute in Honduras that wouldn't let them come to the States. But one of the things that they take down are medical. One of the workers' wives is about to have a baby. You can go to the hospital, but you need to bring all of the supplies that you need for them to hopefully not sew you up, but whatever. They don't have anything in the hospital to dress the wounds with or do anything else, so you have to bring all of that yourself. And so they bring like a basket or something, and they're glad for you to have the baby there, but they don't have any physical supplies to help you in having a baby, which is kind of scary. Yes, you can go to the doctor, but you have to bring any supplies that you can find because they don't have them in the hospital. So a part of this last trip was a suitcase, and Denise is in nursing, but it was a suitcase of just medical supplies that you would want to have if you were having a baby, because, yeah, they got the hospital and they've got the doctor, but you have to bring all of your own things to do that. Well, a lot of prisons, there were a lot of things that were lacking, and sometimes people who visited could help with different things. And I just thought, what an interesting term, visit the widows and orphans. And Jesus says, visiting someone, going to check on them with the intent of helping them. Acts chapter 7, Moses felt strongly about visiting his people. And this is all going to lead eventually to the killing of the Egyptian and him fleeing for 40 years. But living in the palace, he doesn't just go by and say hi. He's going to check on them and check on the intent with them. Paul and Barnabas. Let's go back and visit the churches that we started, another use of the term. When you look at the term distress, this is a word for trouble that inflicts. It can be oppression or other things. And so in dealing with widows and orphans, then James says, pure religion, to visit, look after, care for widows and orphans in their affliction. So when Paul is talking again to Timothy, and I just want to read the verse again, here's some priorities. I am writing to instruct you how to conduct yourself in the household of faith. And I always just think in my mind the family of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground or bulwark of the truth. And so I just want us to briefly look at groups that Paul has mentioned up to this point, because like we said, most of our lesson is going to come from widows and elders specifically. But he has started in chapter 2 and says, I urge that prayer, supplication, petitions, requests be made for all men. He is going to urge that men pray in chapter 2 and verse 8. And then he's going to say to women, I want you to adorn yourselves modestly and sensibly, not with outward apparel, but with good deeds that befit women who profess religion. And so different groups in the church, and we'll see some more, are being addressed. And Paul is very specific. This is what I want you to do in conducting yourself in terms of both the different groups and different things. When I was preaching at Eastside, in concept, I was always 2 to 3 years ahead. In other words, I would know in 25 and 26, Lord willing, this is the lessons we're going to do. And I always tried to be about 6 months ahead in terms of having all the details out, and tried to have Sunday 80% done by lunch on Monday. You don't know what all is going to happen in funerals and everything. And one of the lessons that I had planned for was this women, it's not the outward part, but the inward part. And to make the point, I wore my farm coveralls to church to preach in, just to see if anyone asked me how my spirit was, how my soul was, or anything. And obviously that wasn't your normal thing. Well, this had been planned for a long time, but it happened that Sheila was out of town, and all the older women thought, bless his heart, Sheila picks out his clothes, and he has no idea what to wear when his wife is not at home, which kind of messed with my point a little bit. But by the end of the lesson, I said, did you know no one today has asked me, did I pray this week? No one's asked me about my spirit. No one's asked me about my soul. We're all impacted by the outward appearance. And bless her heart, the lesson would have gone better if Sheila would have been there, because the little ladies wouldn't have been quite as concerned. It was just like they were just going, oh dear. The poor guy doesn't know which clothes to wear when his wife's not there, which is not the case. But humanly, it's very easy to focus on the outside. Men, we want you to pray. We want you to be involved in the leading. And ladies, and here's, I think, a lovely way to say it. With our 2 daughters, Sheila would often say, we want you to be as pretty on the inside as you are the outside, and have a real focus on the spirit and spiritual things. And that's to me a very important focus. And again, a part of the groups that Paul has spoken to. If anyone aspires to be a bishop, an elder, he desires a good thing. And so Paul's going to specifically talk about those qualifications and those characteristics. A deacon, let him first be tested. Timothy, let no one despise your youth. And so the young are going to be talked with and dealt with. And we're going to come back to this in just a second. But I like this term. Paul is going to say, I want you to treat your spiritual family, the household of faith, like, and I always qualify this, like a functional family. There are some dysfunctional families that we don't want to be treated like that, okay? And we all know people who've come out of all kinds of, it just doesn't matter, all kinds of dysfunction in one time or another. And here's this wonderful term, and we're going to see this in a couple of contexts. Now, Timothy, when you speak to the older men, you treat them like fathers. You treat the younger men like brothers. You treat the older women like your mothers, and you treat the younger women with sisters with absolute purity. And so where this brings us today is, and I think this is a very significant term, the word honor is used. And honor has a sense of value. Honor has a sense of worth. And the original words for honor had to do with weight. And so, like, for example, if you were weighing something that was pure gold, the weight of that would be significant. And honor is kind of an outward appearance of appreciation in things. This is both a generational and a time thing, but We grew up in a church where we oftentimes referred to each other as brother and sister. It would be Brother Bill, and that was just how we were taught to speak respectfully. And this is generational as well. But in our family, we were never to call older people by their first name, unless we called them brother. And last names were very good, but there was just a deep sense of respect that was taught. And honor is this word of value. And the people who were the least honored in secular society are the people that Paul's going to give a sense of weight and attention to. And so very specifically, and we'll look at some details here, honor widows who are real widows, and elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor. Lord willing, next week, he will touch briefly something on servants, and especially servants with believing masters. And then there's instructions about the rich. And what I want to do is just kind of stop and just have you kind of look through this and think, if you take the household of faith and you take all the different people who are members of the church, before they became Christians, most of these people, some may have known each other, but a lot of them wouldn't. And here's the thing that's so significant. People are going to come from every strata and every level of society and are going to become a part of the family of God. And within that family, then they have never, this is not good English, but it still communicates what I want to say. These people have never done church before. They're the originals. They're the first ones, and they don't have a heritage of grandparents and other people who've been Christians for a long period of time. And so Paul gives these very specific instructions. And I think of two things. One, yes, Timothy is a young man. I want you to have this letter as kind of the weight of what you're doing. But on the other hand, it's also your life and your example, and it's the Word becoming flesh by you getting to know and to work with and to treat these people as the household of faith. There are three things that he says very specifically to Timothy, do not do this. And I just want to do these three together rather than separating them out. The first one is, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. And we're going to look at this term in a second, but the word rebuke even comes from a physical word like to strike, like to hit someone. And Paul's very specific. If the matter comes and you stop and think, it's going to be some of the elders who are leading the church astray. And if it comes to the point, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him. And we'll look at some details of that in just a second. In 5:21, keep these rules without favor. Do nothing from partiality. You know, it's just human that we get along and we like some people, and some people we have to exercise grace and love and Christianity to deal with. That's just a part of life. And what Paul says, and this is kind of my rough translation, treat everybody in the church the same way. Don't have certain people that you spend more time with because you like them and they like you. And one of the first men that I worked with and had a blessing going through school, was able to work with three different congregations. I don't totally agree with this, but his point of view was, he said, you know, we don't have any friends in the church where we work with. We always have friends outside. And I'm just thinking, yes and no. It's hard for a family to function in a local church if you don't have friends with people who are in the church. And we tend to look at the other way. And this was Hugh McCord. I asked Brother McCord once, I said, how do you decide where to preach? And Brother McCord says, I go to the next church that God asked me to go to. And he said, I don't care how big or how little it is, I just go to the next one. And so that's how we try to do church. We go to the next invitation of someone who asks us. And I feel like we should all have friends, but this is something very important, not to the point of showing partiality. So do not rebuke an older man, do not show partiality, and we'll look at a verse about this, about God, here in a second. And do not be hasty on the laying on of hands and participate in another man's sin. It's very easy to become, and I'm speaking from Timothy's point of view and from a ministry point of view, it's very easy to become defensive when you are being heavily criticized. Without place or location, we went through about a 2-year period of time where there was, even hard to say, there was a deliberate attempt to try to destroy our family by about 12 different people. And when you're in the middle of something like that, you can become so defensive that you lose the capacity to be the salt and the light and leaven that God wants you to be. And so in dealing with the issues and the problems and the false teachers and everything else, don't be hasty in laying hands on people. And a lot of times when you become defensive, you can do something kind of rashly and quickly that you might not do when you were calmer and things were more stable. So those are 3 things, Timothy. Be careful. Don't do these things. Number 1, don't rebuke an older man. Number 2, don't do anything with partiality where one part of the church you're more partial to than others. And do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. So here's these 4 different terms, and this is one of my favorite parts of Timothy, from the point of view that isn't it wonderful when, and this is so true here, isn't it wonderful when we can be a part of a fellowship where basically we're an extended church family? For many of the people that we taught in Australia, they may have migrated, who knows, from England, from Germany, from Canada. Many people didn't have any direct relatives there. And over we would hear people say, I didn't have family until I became a part of the church. And now that I'm a member of the church, then I have this family around me to help me and to work with me. And so when you look at the older men, treat them like fathers, and in that sense, show them respect. And I think that's very important. One of our young men who grew up at Eastside is now the youth worker at Weatherford, Clay Bryant. And Clay has just been such a blessing because, like Timothy, there's that positive, godly influence, but there's not a sense of challenging and rebuking the older generation. He has just done a marvelous job with that. And like I said, this word rebuke literally means to strike at. Younger men, treat them like brothers. So we move from respect with older men to a sense of brotherhood with the younger men. Treat the older women like mothers. And I use that term, a term of affection. Other than knowing that Paul has a sister, because his sister's son heard about the attempt to try to kill him in Jerusalem, we don't know about Paul's extended family, but I love this section in Romans 16 where he's going through this list, and he goes on, he says, well, greet Rufus and his mother who has been a mother to me. Having lost my father and mother 7 weeks apart in 2009, it's always been a blessing to have moms and dads in the church. I've told you this, but we were laughing about this recently. One of the years ago, I was in Australia. My brother Kent came to Eastside. And if you know my brother, he's born on the sunny side of the street. He's lighthearted, youngest one of the family. And growing up, a spanking was worth a good laugh. And that was never the same in my book, but that was just him. And he started and said something about, I'm glad to be here in the place of my older, fatter, balder brother. He said a few things like this and did the lesson. And he said, when I got through, he said, I could see the steam coming out of her ears. And she said, she punched me in the chest. And he said, 1, I'm not sure she heard exactly what I said, being 85, but she was convinced about what she heard. And she said, you can take your smart mouth and go wherever you came from. We'll have your older, fatter brother any day before we'll have a smart mouth like you. And he said, she just went one side and down the other. He said, I got out in the foyer. He said, the other one pushed me against the wall. And she started poking me on the chest. And she said, you can take your smart mouth where you come from. We'll have your older, fatter, balder brother any day before we'll have you. And he said, sleep well while you're gone. He said, the older women are going to protect you, and if anybody comes in and says anything, they're just going to take strips off of them. Well, ladies, please don't be offended, but I sometimes tell people God gives fathers in a family to protect the world from a mother's loyalty to her children. And isn't it wonderful where spiritually we have this sense of looking after each other? And this term, I think of it as a term of affection. Oh, you treat the older women like mothers and the younger women like sisters, and there's that important word, with absolute purity. So when you look at this term purity, it's something without moral defect. And Paul basically says, Timothy, while you're dealing with this difficult situation, that's the defensive side, don't lose sight of building a church family in the church there. And when people can be treated like family, those bonds and those ties are a really significant part of their spiritual relationship. Here's the term in chapter 5 and verse 3, and specifically notice the word again, honor. Honor the widows who are widows indeed. And there's an extended discussion, and notice these terms. A real widow will be without support. As we're going to see, she's going to be at least 60 years of age, and she has some very clear moral requirements about her conduct, but not, and I just did this 2 or 3, not widows who are not young but have a family to care for them. They're not to be looked after by the church, nor either a young widow or a wealthy widow. And so there were a group of women who, because of being widows at this stage of life, and if they didn't have physical family, then this word honor doesn't just mean to say, oh, well, we acknowledge you. The church is going to help provide for them. And we're going to see this in a different context as we go through. So when you look at this term, honor your father and mother, again, the physical family, that's a part of the 10 Commandments. And so in the spiritual family, when we have people who are physically in need, then that word honor there is appropriate. Do you remember when Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they would say, to prevent honoring their father and mother? Well, I would like to help you, but this part of my income is Corban. It's been devoted to God. And because it's devoted to God, we can't help you. And you can go back and look at that. And again, Jesus was very critical of people who didn't care for their own family in that context. So he says in verse 4, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing to God. And godliness in this context, and a lot of times we think of godliness, I think of, both a person who spiritually is thinking and appropriately living like God, but here godliness is showing respect to care for the older members of one's family. Verse 5, she who is truly a widow, left alone, and look at these qualities. She has set her hope on God. She continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives, and this older woman is spiritually minded. She's faithful and devoted to prayer. Command these things so that they may be without reproach if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. What a strong statement. And basically, it's very clear. Those of us who have living family, and specifically living mothers and fathers, then we have a spiritual responsibility, and that's one of those things that pleases God. When you look at the next page, and there's some discussion about this, but this is how I read the passage. Let a widow be enrolled. There's going to be a group of women that I would think through the elders, they may possibly give responsibility to deacons or someone else to care for them. And when we go all the way back to Acts 6, the church has been doing this very early because the Hellenistic Greek widows were being neglected. And so I just put the word criteria. I said that actually the wrong way. She's to be 60 years of age, the wife of one man, and again, I think we're back to when we looked at the elder, a one-woman man. But, and thankfully we don't have to deal with this. There were still some parts of society where there were polygamy. And I'm just glad I've never had to deal with this, but I've talked with friends, and you convert a guy and he's got 4 wives. Bill, what do we do? You know, and it is just really, really difficult in cultures where that's, you know, an ongoing part. But this widow is to be the husband of one wife. She's brought up children. She's shown hospitality. She's washed the feet of the saints. She's cared for the afflicted and has devoted herself to every good work. My brother-in-law, who was a school teacher, not one of our family in ministry, but he's had this saying. He said, if you're allergic to women, you're going to have a hard time in heaven because heaven is going to be filled with godly women. And there's just a lot of women who have filled these characteristics in their personal life. And Paul says she's 60 years old, and then here are the characteristics, and then this is to be the widow who's to be enrolled and to look after. But, in verse 11, refuse to enroll younger widows when their passions draw them away from Christ. And so in some cases, they're going to leave the faith. They desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for abandoning their former faith. Besides, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows to marry and basically assume household responsibilities, have children, and the term's very specific, manage their households, and to give the adversary no occasion for slander. Verse 15, some have strayed after Satan, and if a believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them and let the church not be burdened, that it may care for those who are truly widows. We're going to notice this at the very end, but the longest instruction in the whole book of Timothy is about widows and the responsibility that the church has in that regard. When you look at the elders who rule well are worthy of double honor. The laborer deserves his wages. Do not accept a charge, and this is in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament as well. Do not accept a charge against an elder except in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And here's the same thing. In the presence of God and Christ and the angels, I charge you to keep these instructions without prejudice and do nothing with partiality. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. And then verse 23, and I mentioned this last week. I've talked to people who aren't Christians, and the one verse that they know is that there's some verse in the Bible that says you can drink. And when you notice that the alcohol content and the dilution with water, this was probably to help purify the water, but Paul says no longer drink water only, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. And like I said, I've been amazed at how many people know that something about that is there. When you look at the back page, I'll just summarize a couple of things. Before Christianity became accepted, a lot of people, and again, we're talking about God's plural, a lot of people felt like if there was misfortune that someone suffered, if you help them, you may suffer from the same gods. And so the benevolence in the ancient world was something that was nearly totally missing before Christianity. You're into the 300s. 311, there's the Edict of Toleration. Sorry, I missed the number on that. The first I've got 3:13, it should be 3:11. And Constantine said we're going to tolerate Christians. 3:13, the Edict of Milan, Christianity became the legal religion. And later, he only ruled for 2 years, but his name was Julius the Apostate. To have credibility, he started a benevolent program. And the earlier emperors would never, ever have thought about that. So Timothy, look at the contrast. Be very bold, very direct in dealing with the false teachers. And when it comes to dealing with the household of faith, then we want you to encourage them and to be an example. And we've already mentioned this. The widows were the ones most vulnerable in first century society, and the household of faith was to look after them. And more instructions given to widows than virtually anyone else in the whole book of 1 Timothy. I just think that's very interesting. Peter is taught God is no respecter of persons in going to Cornelius, and the importance of Timothy. You are to honor elders and you are to honor widows. And I just thought how counterculture. Most people in society wouldn't place the value of elders and widows on the same plane, but the same word for honor is used for both of those groups of people. So on the very bottom, and just think about this. Our deeds on earth are witnessed by heaven, and someday we'll answer for those. And here we are in chapter 5 and 21, in the presence of God and Christ and the elect angels. So while Timothy is working with and involved with the business, the functioning, the working of a church on earth, Paul reminds him, the presence of God, Christ, and the elect angels don't do anything out of partiality. Paul reminded the Corinthians, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And that's something that's very sobering, but also is a very important reminder that we may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or bad. And when Paul spoke about people's deeds, some things are hidden and some things are unseen at the time, or they're well known as well. The sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment. The sins of others appear later. So good works are conspicuous, even those that cannot remain hidden. And this is important. Man sees the deeds, but God sees the intention. So Timothy, while you're being criticized, while you have all this stuff going on, don't do anything out of partiality. Treat the members of the church like the family of God, and realize that what you're doing on earth is being witnessed by God, Christ, and the holy angels, and someday he and each of us will give an account of how we've conducted ourselves in the household of God.